So thank you everybody for coming to tonight's presentation. My name is Jody. I'm the curator of the Juneau-Douglas City Museum. I have a couple museum announcements before we get started. First, on Saturday, June 17th, we're hosting a family day at the City Museum. We're going to host these once a month from June to September. It's from 1 to 3 o'clock, and if children bring an adult, the adult gets in free. Kids are always free, so if they bring their parent along, the adult gets in free too. This month we will be making origami and reading A Place Where Sunflowers Grow. In July, the family day will be on July 23rd. On Wednesday, June 21st, if you're interested in another history presentation, Sheila Kelly will be presenting on her book Treadwell of Gold from 7 to 8 at the Douglas Library. That will also be a free event for everybody. The presentation is a precursor to the Perseverance Theater production based on her book, which will run June 22nd through July 3rd. So some great history on the anniversary of the Treadwell disaster. The last thing that I'd like to announce for the museum is thanks to funding received by Benito and Francis Gagin Foundation, Michael and Robert Storr, Allison E. Brown, and the Friends of the City Museum, we are able to expand our hours starting in July. So we will be open 7 days a week, including Sundays. So starting July 2nd, on Sundays, we'll be open from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. through the end of the summer, which is the end of September. So we've gotten funding to do that this year and next year, as well as re-elevate our programming person to full-time. So we are very thankful for that support and very happy to be open 7 days a week again. So come by the museum and see us. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Mike here.
Thank you, Jody. Before I get started, I'd like to take a picture of everybody waving. This picture goes to the Seward House Museum in Auburn, New York, where I've been sending greetings from Alaska to the people who have done a lot to preserve his memory over the years. See if my camera works. Anyway, just wave and smile. About 1, 2, and 3, and that'll do. That does not do. No. It's a horrible picture. Just a second. I wiggled. 1, 2, wave. Much better. Anyway, okay. Yeah. I call this talk For Emancipators, and it's drawn from my 2 books over there. The Man Who Sold Alaska, a short biography of Tsar Alexander II, and The Man Who Bought Alaska, a short biography of William H. Seward, both of which center, of course, on the acquisition of Russian claims in North America by the United States back in 1867, what we like to call the sesquicentennial of the purchase of Alaska. Our first emancipator is William H. Seward. He was born in Florida, New York, a little town about 50 miles from the big city. Florida, the territory, wasn't part of the United States in 1801. His family owned 6 or 7 slaves, which was not uncommon for the better-off New Yorkers at the time. At the time he was born, North America was divided between Spain, Britain, and 16 independent but united states. And then way off the northwest corner up there were a few Russian trading posts. Most of the continent, of course, was occupied by Native Americans. We're not sure how many. Seward studied law, and then he moved to Auburn, New York, which is the hometown of his sweetheart, Frances Miller, the daughter of a wealthy judge. Judge Miller agreed to the marriage as long as Seward and Frances lived in his house, which is today the Seward House Museum there in Auburn. Put it on your bucket list. Seward's passion was politics. He was elected to the New York State Legislature at the age of 29 and became governor at the age of 37. His campaign planks included support for immigration, prison reform, and the legal rights of blacks. By this time, his father's slaves were either dead or had been freed, although many of them continued to live with the family. Both Seward and Frances were opposed to slavery. They used part of the basement in Judge Miller's house to hide people escaping to Canada in the Underground Railroad. Here's a picture of that room. And loaned money to Harriet Tubman, among other things. Tubman and Seward are, in fact, buried fairly near each other in the Auburn Cemetery. He served 1 term as governor, then went back to lawyering, He became rich as a patent attorney with clients like Samuel Morse. But his most famous case involved the pro bono defense of a black man named William Freeman. Freeman had gone deaf and insane from multiple beatings while he was in prison. And when he was released, he killed a white family there in Auburn. The citizens of Auburn wanted to string him up, and Seward argued that any white person in that mental condition would not be tried, and a black man deserved the same rights. He said, "I am not the counsel for the defense, I am the counsel for humanity." It was the first insanity defense to be brought in America. He lost the case, but it made him famous, and made him famous nationwide and helped boost him to the U.S. Senate. In Washington, he took the lead in arguing for territorial expansion and against the expansion of slavery. And as the election of 1860 approached, he assumed that he would be the presidential candidate of the new Republican Party, which he had helped form a few years earlier. Instead, a country lawyer from Illinois was chosen, and Seward was crushed. He went in his house and closed the door. But not for long. His friends got a hold of him and said that he and Lincoln saw eye to eye on important matters, and Lincoln needed Seward's help in order to get elected. And Seward came out all fired up, campaigned from city to city, and helped Lincoln win. Lincoln won with 39.8% of the vote. It's pretty certain he couldn't have done so if Seward hadn't helped. And he picked Seward to become his Secretary of State. Now, some scholars will say that, and Watson's up here, help yourself. Seward himself said the purchase of Alaska was his greatest achievement, but a lot of historians would disagree with him on that. They would say that his greatest achievements were saving the Union probably 3 times during the Civil War era in various ways. Most importantly, in the Trent crisis, when Great Britain came within hours of declaring war on the United States in the middle of the Civil War. Historian Walter Starr, who's written one of the most recent big biographies of Seward, calls it the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 19th century. Seward resolved that crisis almost single-handedly, but there was still great concern that the European powers were going to get involved on the side of the South. Then, all of a sudden, without any announcement, 2 Russian warship fleets showed up simultaneously, one in San Francisco, one in New York. A little courtesy call to our American friends. Seward hosted the officers at one of his fabulous parties. He was famous for his fabulous parties. And it gave a clear signal to any outside power that if they were thinking about interfering in America's little squabble, they would have to deal with the navy of our second emancipator, Tsar Alexander II, the emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, including what we now call Alaska. Alexander was born in 1818, and his family, like Seward's, owned slaves, about 20 million of them. There are some differences between Russian serfs and American slaves, but when the bottom line is both were property, both were forced labor. They could be sold, raped, and beaten by their owners with impunity. Alexander's father, Nicholas I, was one of the most suspicious, iron-fisted, totalitarian rulers ever. He could have given Stalin a run for his money. But he saw to it that his son got a first-class education. And when he came of age, Tsarevich Alexander was sent to Europe to find a wife of suitable rank. He made it as far as England, where he was smitten by Queen Victoria, and she by him. She wrote in her diary, "I'm really quite in love with the Grand Duke." And the rumors in the palace were that if he popped the question, she'd say, "I do, I do." He was like 19, she was 20. The British politicians were mortified. And so was Nicholas, who put a kibosh on the whole thing. Alexander settled for Maximiliana Wilhelmina Augusta Sophie, a German princess who became plain old Tsarina Maria. This is her in later life after having about 6 children on one of her happier days. Nicholas I is best known for the Crimean War, in which Britain and France joined with Turkey against Russia. It's sort of the First World War in some ways. Nicholas was opposed to anything modern, and his army was fighting with the same blunderbusses they'd used against Napoleon. And meanwhile, the Allies, the Turks and the British, had the latest and biggest guns that brought in from the German workshops. They smashed the Russian stronghold in Sevastopol into rubble, There's Sebastopol, and Nicholas went to bed and died. Alexander was now Tsar. This is his coronation in Moscow. And his first #1 task was to stop the war. The peace treaty was humiliating for him, but it was not as bad as it might have been. Russia got to keep the Crimea, for instance, and the treaty said nothing about Turkey's allies in the Caucasus, a region that Russia had been trying to conquer for decades. The toughest resistance came from Muslim tribesmen in Circassia, that's modern-day Dagestan and Chechnya, still trouble spots. They were led by Imam Shamil, shown here. Alexander used a scorched earth policy, deporting or killing every man, woman, and child. The Circassian campaign can only be described as a genocide. And yet Alexander is not remembered as the exterminator. Instead, he's praised by posterity for his reforms. Early in his reign, he expanded freedom of speech and the press. He reformed the military, the clergy, education, the legal system. That one was a tough one. He allowed Jews to serve in the government and live where they wanted to. The word perestroika came into vogue. But the thing that has brought him everlasting glory was his liberation of the serfs in 1861. He told his nobles, "The present system of owning human souls cannot continue." His Emancipation Manifesto was a long and convoluted document that didn't quite work as advertised. I think there's some sort of law of physics out there that the longer any legal document is, the less likely it is to achieve its stated goals. The Emancipation Proclamation, which no one has ever misunderstood, is all 700 words. This was thousands. Anyway, freedom was not instantaneous. The peasants had to buy their land back from the landlords at inflated prices. The process was so burdensome that the serfs rioted and had to be put down with military force. Nevertheless, to this day, this Tsar is known as Alexander the Liberator. What Russians try not to remember about Alexander is that he gave away their country's North American colony. With the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican Cession, America had populations on the west coast and ever-increasing trade with Asia. Russia also had new settlements on its east coast, Nikolaevsk and Vladivostok, both of which, by the way, were settled with help from immigrants from Sitka. The Tsar's brother, Constantine, thought Russian America was a liability, a drain on resources that could be better used in Siberia. He sent a commission to Sitka to dig up dirt, but the commission came back saying that the company's books were in relatively good order, the colony was making a pretty good profit, the population was well treated by Russian standards. The Tsar prepared to extend the Russian-American company's charter for another 20 years. Herb Hope, the late Herb Hope, who was the former president of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, once told me, "We didn't worry too much about the Russians. There weren't that many of them, and they were scared of Indians with guns." One of the places they were particularly afraid of was right here, Klukwan, north of Haines, modern Haines. The Chilkats controlled the key pass between the coast and today's Yukon Territory. And so when the Hudson's Bay Company built Fort Selkirk at the confluence of the Pelly and Yukon rivers, they saw it as an economic threat that had to be answered. A Klukwan leader named Koh'Klux, or Shotridge, among other names, led a party hundreds of miles inland and burned Fort Selkirk to the foundations. There are the foundations being excavated by Parks Canada, and that's all that's left. It was not rebuilt for another 40 years. It was put in a very different location. Koh'Klux, the emancipator number 3, was born in 1817, and yes, he was born into a slave-owning family. Slaves were as much a part of Alaska culture at that time as they were for most of human society, for most of human history. He was regarded with some justification as the most ferocious leader of the most ferocious tribe in Alaska. But as we shall see, fighting was not his only skill. Nor was it exactly the only skill of our fourth and least likely emancipator, Jefferson Davis. Not the president of the Confederacy, but this man, Jefferson Columbus Davis, an Indiana farm boy. When the Mexican War broke out, as a teenager, he enlisted as a private, and by the 1850s, he was an artillery officer assigned to Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina. Davis was single, dashing, and very important in South Carolina, a Democrat. A pro-union Democrat, true, but certainly not an abolitionist. He was very popular with the Charleston gentry and with their eligible daughters. But with the election of Abraham Lincoln, things became tense. For safety, the Fort Moultrie garrison was moved to Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston. It was still incomplete at the time. Davis was the last man to leave Fort Moultrie. And when the shore batteries began shelling Fort Sumter in April of 1861, he loaded his cannons and shot back in the first exchange of fire in the Civil War. He rose quickly through the Union ranks. He was a rarity, an officer who had begun as an enlisted man, and unlike almost every other general in the Union Army, he had combat experience. By the end of 1862, he himself was a general under the command of General Bull Nelson in Kentucky. William Nelson was, in fact, a bully. He belittled Davis, who went to him demanding an apology. Nelson refused, whereupon Davis shot Bull Nelson dead in cold blood. General Sherman got him off the hook and ultimately assigned him to guard his rear in the march through Georgia. By that time, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves in rebel territory. This is 2 years after Alexander freed the serfs in Russia. This very famous engraving shows Lincoln reading a draft of his Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. Notice how everybody is looking at Seward, including Lincoln. Seward was Lincoln's closest confidant and his closest advisor in Washington. He suggested several changes that were incorporated into the final document of the Emancipation Proclamation and also co-wrote or edited many of Lincoln's most famous speeches. He also headed up the efforts to pass the constitutional amendment that ultimately banned slavery nationwide. The Emancipation Proclamation has been good for America, but it was a pain in the butt for Sherman. Here's Sherman in front of Atlanta wondering where his matches are, and for extra bonus points, the name of the horse is Sam. He's in all the statues. As his men moved through Georgia, they were joined by throngs of jubilant slaves who knew they were now free, but weren't exactly sure what that might mean. They became a drag on the Army's advance and threatened the entire enterprise at some point. And it all came to a head at a place called Ebenezer Creek. There was one bridge. It was a very steep defile. Sherman got his main army across the bridge and had Davis hold the rear. In the meantime, the South's best cavalryman, fighting Joe Wheeler, was closing in quickly. There's Joe Wheeler wearing a blue uniform in the Spanish-American War with a couple of his subordinates, Leonard Wood in the middle and Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt on the other side. A fascinating story, but not quite. Joe Wheeler, yeah, look him up. He's a fascinating dude. Anyway, Davis got his men across the bridge just in the nick of time and then blew it up, leaving all the blacks on the other side for Wheeler to sort out and get back to their plantations. Word of the Ebenezer Creek incident reached the northern press and set off a firestorm. Sherman was met in Savannah by none other than the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton himself. Stanton demanded that Davis be handed over in chains for court-martial. Sherman refused. Said, I'm trying to fight a war, not run a charity here, and Stanton had to back down, which he didn't do very often, and he certainly didn't do very generously. The Civil War was coming to a conclusion when Seward took a tumble from this carriage at the Seward House Museum. He suffered a concussion, a broken shoulder, and a broken jaw. He was still bedridden when the war ended. On the night of April 14, 1865, a big stranger came into the Seward house, bludgeoned Seward's son Frederick with a pistol, and then pushed his way into the sick room where he stabbed Seward several times with a knife. An army nurse and Seward's oldest son, Augustus, finally wrestled him out. Seward's wounds were extremely serious, and Frederick's were even worse. Miraculously, they both survived, but his wife did not. Frances, essentially from the stress of the whole thing, died within 30 days of the attack. A couple of days after the attack, Seward regained enough consciousness that he asked to be taken to a window. As he looked out the window, he saw the flags at half-mast and realized something no one had been willing to tell him. And he said, the president is dead. And he rolled over and started to cry. The man who had tried to kill him, Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne, was a collaborator with John Wilkes Booth. Booth's grand plan had been to kill Lincoln, Seward, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and General U.S. Grant all on the same night, at the same hour if possible. The plan mostly failed. but we're all aware of how tragically successful the successful part was. It was a bad time for Koh'Klux as well. 3 high-ranking Chilkats were killed by Sitka people. Justice demanded a life for a life, but the Russian garrison in Sitka prevented a retaliatory raid. It was also a horrible year for Alexander. The emancipation did not go smoothly. Landowners in Poland, which was part of the Russian Empire, hated it. They joined students in a rebellion that was suppressed by the Russian army. Hundreds of Poles were executed, tens of thousands were sent into exile. But in another part of the empire, the Tsar gave a constitution and political rights to the Finns. It was also part of the Russian Empire. But while he remained the absolute dictator in Russia and Poland, he became a constitutional monarch in Finland, the first time that ever happened in Russian territory. Here's the statue of him in Helsinki, where he's still called Alexander the Liberator, or the Good Tsar, to contrast him with all the other Tsars. Adding to Alexander's grief was the death from tuberculosis of his eldest son, Nicholas. The heir to the throne, the Tsarevich, was considered intellectually brilliant, humane, a born leader with all the ideal qualities of a great future Tsar. His death was not only a tragedy for Alexander, but for Russia, and perhaps for the world. It left Alexander with 4 other sons: Chimp, Larry Moe, and Curly Joe. The second from the bottom there was the future Alexander III. He was considered a soft-hearted, soft-headed, lovable bumpkin, and he almost came to the throne before his time when a university dropout tried to shoot the Tsar. The first of several assassination attempts. Now, talk about selling Alaska to the United States had been going on for 30 years, broken up by various things. One was the distance in communications, which slowed things down, and the Civil War, which sort of put discussions on the table. But when the Civil War ended, America had a little more time to think about things, and Russia decided to act. And helping the whole process was the laying in 1866 of the first really successful transatlantic telegraph cable. Seward wrote to his daughter, he says, "I wonder how this is going to change the way I do business." Alaska is one of the big ways it changed. Most of Alexander's advisors opposed the sale, but his brother Constantine was more insistent than ever that the Russian Empire would be better off without Russia. The discussions got serious in 1867 under Edward de Steckel, the Russian ambassador to the United States. He'd been in America for about 20 years by that point, married to an American girl. Was looking for a promotion to get out of the sticks of America, though. Late on the night of March 29th, real late, like 11 p.m., he stopped by the Seward house where the family was playing cards. Seward was a card shark at the game of whist, which is kind of like bridge, and addicted to it. He stopped by and he told Seward that he'd just received approval from the Tsar for the sale, with the price now set at $77.42. Okay, you're all eligible for PFDs. He said, "I can come by and we can do it tomorrow if you like." And Seward shoved the table away, set down his card, shoved the table away, and said, "Let's do it right now." By midnight, the lights were on at the State Department, and the translators were in place, and the documents were being worked out, and the treaty was done by about 4:30 in the morning. This is the famous picture. There's a copy of it at the museum here, and the real thing usually hangs in the Seward House Museum above the dining room table. It's very high, very hard to see. Right now it's at the Anchorage Museum at eye level, which is very nice. It's eventually going to be here, I understand, in October. So I'll give a good look at it. It's by the same man who painted Washington crossing to Delaware and did all these historical things. Anyway, Seward grabs the papers, rushes them over to the White House for Andrew Johnson to sign. He gets them with Johnson's signature, and he rushes them over to the Capitol, where the Senate is preparing to adjourn for the year. And he walks in and says, "A treaty for the cession of Russian America," and everybody gasps, except Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who had a heads up on the whole thing. A few days later, the Senate reconvened in a special session, and after a 3-hour speech by Sumner here, they ratified the treaty 37-2. Sumner's speech, by the way, is somewhat longer than my entire book about Seward. 3-hour speeches seem to be the rule back in the 1860s. It would take more than a year for the House to appropriate the funds, but as far as Seward was concerned, it was a done deal. He rushed news to the local papers, and with the speed of transatlantic cable, it was picked up by newspapers in Europe, and from there, the Russian people finally found out about it from foreigners. The Russian people were not happy. One admiral was cashiered because he objected too loudly. The editorials were so scathing that Alexander threatened publishers with charges of sedition if they kept it up. De Steckel, who had been expecting a big promotion, was instead pensioned off. A century later, American historian Hector Chavigny said he could find no mention of de Steckel in any Russian reference book. The Russian historian Edward Brzezinski puts it this way: the sale of Alaska is the one thing for which Russians have still not forgiven Alexander II. And for bonus points, the name of the dog is Milord. It's in every painting and in every photograph of the Tsar from this particular period. So is the cigarette or the cigarillo he smoked in there, which I find interesting because Seward was addicted to cigars. All the descriptions of him, he was constantly smoking it. He was awake, had it in his mouth or in his hand. There's not a single picture I've ever found of Seward with a cigar, but there's a whole box of his cigars at the Seward House Museum. Some of them halfway smoked. Well, historical. So why did Alexander do it? There was no official press release, and we will never really know. But the prevailing theory has always pointed to the vulnerability of the colony. It's not often noted, but there was a Pacific front to the Crimean War. A joint British-French fleet attacked Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula. They were driven back and retreated to Victoria, British Columbia. But had the fleet turned north, just a few hundred miles, it could have taken Korea and Sitka without firing a shot. Here's St. Petersburg, and there's the Crimean Peninsula, where the real big battles happened, a huge battle off St. Petersburg as well. Here's Petropavlovsk. There's Victoria. There's Sitka. That's how close Alaska was to the Crimean War. We don't find out about this, by the way, this is just a historical thing, in English histories of the Crimean War, because it was a hell of a loss for the Brits. They hit with overwhelming force, and they were shoved into the sea by a bunch of fur hunters. And but you find it in Russian histories. It's still a big monument there, the Battle of the Siege of Petropavlovsk. And then 9 years later, after the Crimean War and the American Civil War, right after the Civil War actually, the Confederate raider, the Shenandoah, went into the Bering Sea and sank the whole Yankee whaling fleet, sending millions of dollars of whale oil down to the Rhine Geese. It was the final shot of the Civil War, and Constantine might have argued if a single lightly armed warship could do this much damage, what might a real navy do in our armies, in our waters? The next question is, why did America want it? Seward was convinced that sooner or later America and Canada would be one big happy country. And having Alaska in the portfolio would just sort of round out the set, I suppose. Also, he saw the advantage of the Great Circle route for trade between Japan and San Francisco, the shortest route. It's shown on this map up in that insert as a straight line cutting right through the bottom of Alaska. Actually, the shortest route goes up above the Aleutians and back down through them. And thousands of foreign flag vessels take this route every year. It's an international waterway. People in Juneau seem a little more aware of this than people in the rest of Alaska, but most of them don't know anything about this. This big piece of the World Trade puzzle. This map was produced shortly after Sumner's speech, and it's pretty well known to us up here, the historical thing. It's the first time the word Alaska is used to describe the entire geographical division there. Now, Seward may seem like he was in a big rush to get this whole thing done, and he was. That's because he saw the window of opportunity was closing up fast. Congress was very mad at President Johnson, and Johnson was mad at them. The next year, he was impeached by the House of Representatives, and Seward arranged for his defense. The Senate ultimately fell one vote short of removing Johnson from office. And Seward, who had helped create the Republican Party, was now reviled by his fellow Republicans for helping Johnson, a Democrat. He did it because he thought the charges were unconstitutional, the grounds for impeachment were unconstitutional, and also because he had seen what happened in South and Central American republics when one branch of the government usurped the powers of another, how it led to chaos, dictatorships, coups, and more civil wars. With Alaska off the table in May of 1867, Alexander went to Paris, ostensibly to see the great international exhibition that was on display at that time, but really to see his secret wife, Ekaterina Dolgoruski. She bore him 3 children, and on the death of Tsarina Maria became his official wife. They really did love each other. It's a beautiful little story. It then turned into 2 big screen movies, by the way, one in France and one in Austria, with major stars. And while Alexander was in Paris, he was riding in the carriage with Emperor Napoleon III, and a Polish exile came up to the carriage and fired 2 shots at point-blank range. Both missed, which may explain how the Poles lost their revolt. Both shots missed, but it was a very close call. Davis could only wish for that kind of excitement. At the end of the Civil War, he was made the military governor of Kentucky. He built hospitals for the freed slaves and schools for their children. He overruled Kentucky laws that did things like prevent a black man from testifying in court. He suppressed the regulators, which were kind of a Kentucky version of the Ku Klux Klan. But it was all bureaucratic stuff that he did not really care much for. What he really wanted to do is join his old troop out west in hot battles with the Indians. He was thrilled when he got an envelope with new orders in his hands. He opened the envelope and it said, "You are to assume the duties of governor of the military district of Alaska." Alaska. He may have thought he was being punished for killing Bull Nelson, or maybe Stanton was getting even with him for the Ebenezer Creek business. But he shipped out and took command of Alaska at the ceremony in Sitka on October 18, 1867. He had his hands full. He'd come off the boat with more than 200 troops, by far the biggest professional armed force that Alaska had ever seen. And they all needed housing. The Russian civilians living in government property were evicted and left with nowhere to go. Most returned to the motherland in disgust. A group of opportunistic Americans showed up, and they thought they were on the frontier, on the forefront of the next San Francisco. They formed their own city government and acted as if they were in charge, and the complaints of everyone came to Davis's desk. To add to his troubles, the U.S. Army, in its wisdom, decided to send him their absolute worst convicts to become work crews. Except for Davis, he'll handle the whole thing out. Now, he kept a wary eye on the Tlingit population. This picture's taken in Wrangell, by the way. But he said he was impressed by their industry, their intelligence, and their respect for the law. I love this picture because it shows kind of an ethnically mixed group there. And it's rare for pictures from this era in Alaska to be so unposed. The photographer is Edward Muybridge, who took the famous running horse, series of running horse pictures that are supposed to have been the predecessor to moving pictures. He was up here in 1868, and I'm sure he's just trying to get a picture of the boat, and he runs across these people who are either waiting for the tide to change or just back from a picnic. It looks like some kind of celebration may have been going on. Maybe a wedding, who knows? And he asked them to stand still long enough to take the picture. He wanted to meet the man with the ribbon in his hair one of these days and ask him what was going on. The Indians also had a certain respect for him. Herb Hope recounted how an Indian, a Russian, and a blue-coat American soldier were all put in the jail cell at the same time for the same offense. Drunken and disorderly conduct, what else? And he said this story spread through the village like wildfire. In another case, soldiers looted St. Michael's Cathedral. Davis had them court-martialed and drummed out of the service in a humiliating public spectacle, stripped of their buttons and shipped out and told never to return. It was a very impressive ceremony. His own troops were really his biggest headache. They were idle and they were bored. They tended to find bootleg booze and get into trouble. Some of the same men who had just fought the war to end slavery were caught buying Indian children to be their slaves. Davis made them give the children back. But his orders didn't say anything about slavery between the Indians, and he took no effort to stop that. He did, however, stop the practice of killing slaves for certain important events, like the death of a chief. Now, in the late summer, early fall of 1868, Koh'Klux came to Sitka with several warriors, chiefs, and delegations from Wrangell, Cape, and elsewhere. They were all present in town, and a lot of business was under discussion. This may or may not actually be Tlingit chiefs in Sitka. It's taken at the time of the meeting. And the guy in white might be Koh'Klux, hard to tell. Or they might be U.S. soldiers dressed up in stuff, because Muybridge loved to pose photographs. He was kind of notorious for it. However, the caption says, distinguished chiefs meeting in Sitka. As many as 1,200 Tlinkits lived in Sitka, in part of the place actually to the right of the castle here, known as Indian Town. Davis put a sentry at the gate of the town and imposed a curfew. On New Year, that's basically what he would have been doing in Kentucky, by the way, as well. On New Year's Day, Koh'Klux and some of his friends came back to town after curfew. They were challenged by the sentry, and Koh'Klux snatched his gun and walked off laughing. Davis wasn't laughing. He sent soldiers into the village and told them to bring back Koh'Klux and the rifle. A crowd gathered, shots were exchanged, and at least one man was killed. The soldiers retreated to the castle in a panic and prepared for a full-blown uprising. In the morning, Davis summoned the Tlingit leaders to the village, to his castle, and he showed them his cannons pointed at their homes. Davis said he would fire if they didn't turn over Koh'Klux. Well, we can't do that, they said. We don't want to fight the Chilkats any more than we want to fight you. We'll put white flags over our houses. That's the way you do it, right? Throughout the day, Davis paced back and forth in front of his loaded cannons, muttering, "I can't kill all those people for just one man." Finally, he walked into the village alone, knocked on the door where Koh'Klux was staying, and placed him under arrest. And the Sitka people honored their white flags and let him be marched off to jail. Davis then imposed a travel ban until the situation could calm down, but some cavemen tried to leave by sea and were fired on. One was killed. On their way back home, the survivors found two white prospectors and killed them in blood retribution. I lost my train. Oh, there we go. In response, Davis burned cake to the ground. The cake people had warning and got out, but it was lean times until spring. Everyone was still on edge when an astronomer came to Davis with a request. He said a full eclipse of the sun is going to happen on August 5, and Klukwan would be the perfect place to watch it. Is it safe to go there? Davis went down to talk to Koh'Klux in his cell, and he offered the chief his freedom if he could guarantee the safety of the whites coming to the village to observe the eclipse. Koh'Klux agreed. At the same time he was heading back to Klukwan, U.S. Grant was headed for the White House as the newly elected president, that March of 1869, and bringing his own administration with him. Seward was now out of a job and went back to Auburn, but he didn't stay very long. May of that year saw the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and Seward was one of its very first customers. He took the train to San Francisco, where he received a hero's welcome. People followed his carriage in the streets cheering after him. The big money men fought with each other to entertain him. The Chinese American Society paid a call on him, and the government of Mexico invited him to make a state visit. He was offered a beautiful yacht, the Active, for a voyage to Alaska. And in Sitka, he toured the tannery, the ice house, the brewery. He went to church at both St. Michael's and the Finnish Lutheran Church. And he spent a lot of time and money in the Tlingit town at gift shops making purchases. There was already a tourist shop industry up and running in Sitka, almost as if they could see the future. He sent home crates of masks and baskets and carvings and weavings and even a live bald eagle. And of course he jumped at the chance to go see an eclipse. Koh'Klux set up a special cabin for him, and Klukwan is the only place in Alaska where Seward spent the night on shore. The next day, the eclipse happened on schedule. The skies cleared. It was a great success. Everyone was in a cheerful mood and congratulating each other. And Koh'Klux invited everyone to his house, the famous whale house, with the famous screen and these incredible house posts that are still on display in like perfect condition in Klukwan. Put it on your bucket list. I'm not joking. It's like having Michelangelo's David 100 miles away and not going to see it. Actually, it's probably easier to get to Florence than to Klukwan, but there you are. Anyway, inside the big house of Koh'Klux, as it was known, or the whale house, Seward and Davis found themselves surrounded by about 400 very solemn Chilkat men and women in full regalia. Koh'Klux explained the murders of the Chilkats by the Sitka people and asked Seward, "What are you going to do about it?" What unfolded was this match between two master negotiators. And in the end, the Chilkats accepted 36 blankets as recompense. This made everybody happy. The Chilkats and the Sitka people, who both had relatives in each other's village they hadn't been able to visit for years. It made Davis happy, one less thing for him to worry about. And it made Seward very happy, and he invited everyone to one of his fabulous parties aboard the yacht. I don't know how the Cooks pulled this off, by the way. Everyone who was anyone in Klukwan made it to the boat, and the whites were astonished when Koh'Klux showed up wearing an impeccable black suit. I use this picture to mention, when I mentioned Koh'Klux, it is not him. It was taken 5 or 10 years after his death, part of that same series of postcard photos of the whale house. But why, in this one particular picture, is this one man not wearing traditional regalia? He's the only one wearing Western dress. A formal black suit from about 30 or 40 years before the picture was taken. This is total theory, but I would submit this is the coat that Koh'Klux wore when he met Seward on the boat. And it was kept as a souvenir. Because if you go to the Seward house, you will find the suit that Seward wore when he met Queen Victoria, still on display. Sometimes people keep these things. And there's a reason that's in there. Seward, by the way, then returned back to California via Oregon, and he made a long wagon trip across California, and then he went through Mexico on a long, long heroic state visit through the Caribbean, and he finally got back to Auburn about a year after he left, but he didn't stay long. He was old and ailing, but in 1871, this is before Jules Verne's book came out, he makes a trip around the world. He could, because of his injuries and the carriage accident and then the slashing thing, probably some just general getting old stuff, he could no longer get a soup spoon to his lips. He required a lot of help. But he makes this journey across back to San Francisco by train, a month-long voyage on a steamship across the Pacific to Japan, where he meets the Mikado, and then to China, Indonesia, India, the Middle East, Turkey, Europe, and finally back home across the Atlantic. He was working on a book about the adventures when he died here at on that green couch at his house on October 10, 1872. Jeff Davis was reassigned to California, where in 1873 he ended the California Indian Wars by hanging the Modoc chief, Captain Jack. Some of us prefer to call it the California Indian Genocide. It's something California still needs to answer for, in my opinion. But his health went into decline. He was kept on the payroll of the Army until he finally died in Chicago in 1879. Disaster awaited Alexander. He planned now to do what he had hoped would be his crowning achievement, the unification of all the Slavic peoples under his rule. Turkey owned much of Eastern Europe in the 1870s. Slavs in the Balkans and Bulgaria revolted and were answered with atrocities, the executions of whole villages, impaling of babies, that sort of thing. The Russian public was outraged and demanded that the Tsar take action. He joined his troops in the field, and they were stalled at the Turkish garrison of Plevna in Bulgaria. The battle took tens of thousands of Russian lives before the Turks were finally starved out. Alexander was able to ride into Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, without firing a shot after that. And Bulgaria, this is the statue of him in Sofia. Bulgaria is another place where he is still Alexander the Liberator. The ethnic Turks, and that was about half the population, fled in a panic. Alexander's troops steamrolled towards Constantinople, and they got within 12 miles of the city. The generals begged him to let him take it. But his diplomats warned him that if he did that, he'd risk another war with France and Britain. At the negotiating table, all of Europe piled on, grabbing at pieces of the pie that Turkey had abandoned. Bulgaria got its independence, Austria got a chunk of the Balkans, setting the stage for World War I, and Russia got relatively little. The public was frustrated and bitter that so many lives had been lost for so negligible results. A rebellious mood set in. A secret group that called itself People's Will preached that the only way to move forward was to kill the Tsar. A campaign of terror ensued with anarchists setting fires and attacking public officials, sometimes in broad daylight. There was another attempt to shoot Alexander, then the train that was thought to be carrying him was blown up with dynamite. Another bomb went off inside the Winter Palace while the royal family was there. Alexander's response was to declare an all-out war on terror. The secret police arrested people left and right. Civil rights and freedom of the press were rescinded. The country was placed under military law, but still the turmoil continued everywhere. everywhere except for Kharkov in the Ukraine. The governor of Kharkov was Mikhail Melikov, who later became an Arctic explorer. He was an Armenian veteran of the Caucasus Wars, and he had this almost supernatural ability to enforce strict laws while charming the public. Alexander had him take over the war on terror. Now, the terrorists were good at making bombs, but they were not so good at covering their tracks. Loris Melikov was able to round most of them up, not quite all. A troop of 5 remained, led by this woman, Sofia Perovskaya, and they were under the radar. But with the main leaders rounded up, Loris Melikov advised the Tsar to restore civil rights and meet whatever demands he could. He agreed, and soon enough things calmed down. He then began work on what would have been his crowning achievement, a constitution for Russia. Russia's first. It would have allowed elections, and made the Tsar a constitutional monarch. The document was completed, and Alexander prepared to make it the law in early March 1881. On March 1st, he was riding in an armored carriage when a man hurled a bomb, killing a bystander and a guard. Alexander got out of the carriage to help the wounded, and at that, a second man threw a second bomb, and this one killed him. Under his successor, Alexander III, the reforms were reversed. The persecution of Jews resumed. There would be no constitution. This church stands at the place where Alexander was killed in St. Petersburg. It is called the Cathedral on Spilled Blood. Yeah, put it on your bucket list.
Was it Petersburg?
How's that?
You said Petersburg?
It's St. Petersburg. Not our Petersburg.
No, I
Petrograd. Yeah, Petersburg in Russia. The Cathedral on Spilled Blood. That's a must-see when you're there. Now, Koh'Klux, the only one now surviving, became known as a peacemaker. He was one of the leaders who helped locate the site for the Presbyterian mission in Haines in the late 1870s. He himself remained a pagan of pagans, as the missionaries called him. They did not like him. But he acknowledged that his people wanted the education and jobs that they thought the mission might bring their way. When John Muir met the old chief, he was wearing a mind-bogglingly expensive chinchilla cloak. It had a tag that read, "To Chartridge from his friend, William Seward." This is Koh'Klux's grave in Klukwan. Go back. He walked into the woods, as I think he would like us to say, in 1889, a couple of years after he himself had finally freed his own slaves, and he was likely the last rich man in North America to do so. And that was the real end of private slavery in America. And this is the real end of my talk. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to talk. I have questions for all of you, too. Thanks. Oh, and shameless plug, of course. I did bring books with me. The publisher's list price is $16 each. You can have the pair from me for $30. I don't want to fly them back to Anchorage. There'll also be a pair left here at the library, so if you really want to check them. Yes, sir.
The name of that village you said that we should put on our bucket list is?
How do
you get there?
Take the ferry to Haines and drive about 30 miles up the road, 30, 40 miles up the road. It's before you get to the Canadian border. And the only thing to see or do in Klukwan is to go to their cultural heritage site. And the poles are beautifully presented in really good condition. They're made by a man named Kajitsu Ash, worked in around 1800, 1805. He also did the Chief Sheikh's house posts in Wrangell. And they're just fabulous. I mean, it's, you know, they talk about the old totems, it seemed like they were talking to you, and these are there. These are amazing. As far as I'm concerned, they're probably the premium piece of artwork in Alaska. That's my opinion. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Ma'am.
You mentioned that you feel like the negotiations for the sale or the transfer had been going on for a good 20 or 30 years. And
yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, they actually, it was broached for the first time in the reign of Nicholas I in like the 1830s. James Buchanan, future president, was the ambassador to Russia. He's one of 2 presidents we've had who can speak Russian. And it was brought up with him, and he said, well, we'll talk about it. In the Crimean War, America was about the only country that sided with Russia. We couldn't do much, but you know, we hated the British as much as they did. And, but you know, so the topic had come up, and it sort of went back to Washington, D.C., where it didn't go anywhere. And when somebody did bring it up, Franklin Pierce sort of stirred it up again. These exchanges are taking months at a time to complete. And they get back to Russia. Now they're not interested. And now Constantine's saying, yeah, we ought to sell it to the Americans if we can get them to take it. And let's go for $5 million. Might get $5 million out of the deal. And no, the message is coming back to Washington, D.C. Oh, we got a civil war going on. I mean, it took forever. I believe it was the transatlantic cable that made the whole thing possible. You could exchange messages in a matter of hours or days rather than weeks and months waiting for a ship to come across with a note. And the other thing that made it happen was that very night, when he got the word, Seward left his cards and immediately did the deal. Because if the Senate had gone into adjournment and left town, they would have been rounding up worms to get them back together for a special session. It probably wouldn't have happened until the fall, late summer or fall, early fall. By that point, Johnson's reputation was way downhill. He was in his horn locking thing with Stanton, and the War Department was occupied by Stanton and his supporters, and Johnson was trying. It was a big mess, and they wouldn't have acted on this. They would have just said, "We're on." Although it was a very popular deal with the rest of the country when it went through most of the newspapers, and the whole Seward's Folly thing is much exaggerated, mainly by Alaskans. But the rest of the country seemed to be very positive about it. There's a great poem by Bret Harte called, The New Colossus, and it's about Alaska, and it's a pretty snarky little funny poem. Glaciers, icebergs, make salam, you belong to Uncle Sam. It was published in the San Francisco Chronicle, I believe. Yes?
So the Alaska Natives who are living in Sitka and other places under the Russian-American company, how did their rights change overnight when they become under U.S. Army administration?
On paper, nothing had happened. They were Native people or residents of Alaska living in settled places were all said to be citizens or civilized and therefore entitled to American citizenship and full rights. That was on paper. The treaty is really not one of the better written ones in a lot of ways. Now the Russians, of course, civil rights sort of came and went, and this was very far away. But what had happened under Russian rule is that you were getting to build up a very large mixed race population, the Creole populations they were called, and they were the leaders of the community. They were the link between the Russian rulers on one side of their family and the owners of the land, their Indian families on the other side, or Aleut was the other thing. And they were the administrators. They were shipped off to Russia for college educations and came back to run the books and run the companies and build the ships. Another great story from Herb Hope. This has to do with the governor, the second to last Russian governor we had, a guy named Furuhelm, who at one point was very frustrated, and I guess there may have been some sort of rebellion brewing, in fact, and he pulled out his almanac and he threatened the Indians that he was going to black out the sun if they didn't do what he said, and the eclipse happened, and the rebellion didn't happen. And he was very proud of this stuff. The way he counted, Herb said, we knew all about eclipses. We had kids who'd come back from college studying astronomy. It was not that hard to explain. And actually, on board the ship, at one point, Koh'Klux asks Seward to explain what had happened. I think he may have been wanting to know something about all this equipment that was there and all these people who were running around staring at the equipment rather than the eclipse. What were they doing? And the question was misunderstood. And Seward gets a lamp and a ball and an orange and tries to demonstrate what's going on. At the end of it, Koh'Klux says something to the effect of, I see, so it's the Great Spirit's work. We've always noticed that the Great Spirit does whatever the Blue Coats tell him to do. Now, Frederick, who writes all of this down in his biography of his father, seems to interpret that as sort of being spoken from ignorance. And for someone from Alaska, you realize that was a joke, man. that was a really funny joke. And it sort of went over Frederick's head. But I think Seward may have got it. he actually mentions Koh'Klux in a speech he gives in Sitka. It says he's a very intelligent man. He's told me what's behind those mountains, and that's stuff we want. We got to get it. So that was different. But one of the big changes was actually social. The Creoles had been the cream, the elite of Alaska society under the Russians. Under the Americans, they were half-breeds and looked down upon. And, really this continued, a very long time. Perhaps it's still kind of a social thing in certain places. I grew up out west in the small Yupik villages. And one of the great claims to fame you could have if you were a Yupik kid was you had a bit of Russian in you somewhere. And if you didn't have Russian, you were Aleut. And this was all seen as, I was like, oh, Russian, oh, that's cool. I thought it was cool. Russian, kind of an exotic place. There was the social change that had, and the other thing was, I think the attitude of the soldiers themselves. I mean, Jeff Davis, this is a military, he's a general. He's used to telling 10,000 men, go in there and fight or die. He wasn't used to being crossed at all. The Russians probably wouldn't have taken revenge and cake the way they did, the way he did. He was exonerated by the Army, but the Army at this point, of course, is involved in some pretty large-scale campaigns against Indians in the lower 48. Some big stuff, and big casualties. And the other thing you got to remember is that, I mean, Herbert also mentioned to me the fact that one of the reasons he thought the chiefs were getting together was to see if they could get some attorneys. The question was, are there enough of us to push these guys out? And or should we go the legal route? They opted to try the legal route, which went nowhere very quickly, but eventually has had fruits in the long run, which is better than the Senecas, Seward's home state, who are still fighting lawsuits that are running on to 200 years long. I met a Seneca from Oklahoma one time and asked her how the cases were going, and she said, the Egyptians had their dynasties, their lists of dynasties. We have our lists of lawyers who have handled this case and died before it ever got to the next step. And, so it is interesting from that standpoint. But the argument was that you misunderstood. We had a business relationship with the Russians. They didn't own the place. It wasn't going to fly with the Yankee soldiers. They just finished conquering 13 independent places. Thought they were independent sovereign states, and it cost millions of lives, or hundreds of thousands of lives, and they come on those minutes. It's kind of a different thing, though. The whole question about land ownership and international claims is way above my ability to understand. I don't understand parking tickets. But Willie Hensley's book's a good place to start on a lot of that. There are some pretty darn good books about how this has all come down, and they're really not part of this particular story, which are very short, tidy biographies, newspaper things. Yes?
I've read that there's some sort of a popular movement in Russia to say if we were swindled with Alaska, they want to reclaim it. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I know a little bit, but I think it's the same type of people who, like the Americans, who want to claim Wrangel Island, north of Siberia, because I don't know why. It makes no sense at all. But it's a crank fringe. They'll bring this up, and they still talk about it. I mean, about the Americans that used to be, they used to have a piece of America. You can understand the loss of pride and something like that, but it's, realistically, say what you will about Ivan, he can be shifty and untrustable, but if he signed a piece of paper in a business deal, he's usually going to keep his end of it. That's a different animal. It wasn't taken by force. It wasn't taken by trickery at the negotiating table. It was something you looked at and said, okay, you got it. Where's my 7.2? And it's not very spread in Russia. It's a piece of the history, but they're not going to try at this point, any more than we're going to try to get the Philippines back. Yeah?
So I appreciated the part in your talk where you did the sort of the follow-up. Where did they go after the sale of the rights? And it sounded like the shtetl fell off of the face of the earth or something. And I'm wondering, he married a gal from East Longmeadow, Massachusetts.
Awesome. Yeah.
And I was wondering if you thought that there was a potential for him to resettle on the East Coast somewhere.
Curiously enough, I have known people in Alaska named Steckel, spelled the same way. But I believe he received a serious pension. It was good money, and he went to Nice. which is where all the Russians went when they were pensioned off. It was a Russian colony there well after the revolution. It's Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, you know. There are enough of them there that they're still there. And I think he actually died in Paris, however. I'm not quite sure when. But yeah, he lived out his days in France. Yes?
How would you compare the Alaska Purchase to the Louisiana Purchase?
Well, the subtitle there, The World's Best Real Estate Deal, that was the publisher's idea, not mine. Thomas Jefferson still gets the top billing in that department. It was more territory. It was St. Louis. I mean, it's some really great corn land. I mean, it was a totally different thing. And again, it was quick action on his part. I mean, remember, Jefferson did not like the idea of spending public money on anything. He won the election over Adams by being the tight-fisted guy. He wasn't going to spend any money. And now he had to come up with $14 million, and he did. He just signed off on it immediately and ramrodded it through Congress, and everyone thought it was a great idea, except Seward was saying, Seward with the Mexican War, he said, we have the Louisiana Purchase, we don't need any more useless territory. Of course, the day after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and that was by force. I mean, we gave the Mexicans $14 million for that too, but it was part of stopping the war. The very day it was being signed, gold was found at Sutter's Mill. And Sutter had gotten his start in California by buying Fort Ross from the Russians. If they'd held out a little longer, well, they would have had the same problem the Spaniards had, which were tens of thousands of Americans pouring across the border, all armed and looking for something they could have. It was the same reason the Russians wouldn't talk about gold up here. They didn't want to have a gold rush on their hands with 200 Russians versus 200,000 crazy Americans up here. It is interesting, the AJ mine over a period of 30 or 40 years produced 100 times $7.2 million. And with the Treadwell thing as well, it would be interesting to talk when that shows up. But, the Pribilof seal fur industry paid off the purchase of Alaska within about 4 or 5 years. It didn't take that long for it to come back. And as I've always kind of noted, the Alaska Railroad took a tenth of the federal budget to build when they were building that. It paid for itself in Stalingrad when the Russians had planes. And part of that was because of the way we were able to supply them thanks to a railroad into the middle of nowhere. So it's interesting the way history works. But one of the questions I always like to ask audiences is what would have happened if the sale had not gone through? If they hadn't reached this treaty of cession and it had remained in Russian hands after March.
Canada
During
during the Klondike, because there would have been no, Russia wouldn't have had the ability to stop the gold rush or the people flocking north.
Probably not, yeah. Yeah, that was the other half of Herb Hope's comment about was, when the Americans showed up, there were just so many of them, we didn't know what to do. We didn't know where they were coming from. Yes, sir.
At the time of the purchase, was the Yukon border already established with
It
Alaska?
was already established with a treaty in like 1825. That long straight line from the Arctic Ocean to Mount St. Elias was drawn on a map through country that neither Russian or British had ever seen. One thing that's kind of cool though is the Alaska-Canada border is the longest international border over which no army has ever crossed in time of war. Had raids, incidents, really namby-pamby little things there. Of course, Hooks didn't kill anybody when he burned Fort Selkirk to the ground because no one had been killed. There was no cause for blood retribution. Just get out. It won't be so nice next time. But that always kind of strikes me. We live in this wonderful world up here because we have such good neighbors. We've never fought each other across that particular piece of border.
One of the things I love about that border and that particular treaty is that during the negotiations, the Russians said, okay, we'll move the border 2 or 3 degrees west in exchange for the mainland portion of southeast. Mm-hmm. And in that little strip is the Klondike gold fields. Yeah,
it was. Yeah, it was right there. Yeah, they would have, of course, would have taken them probably another 50 years to get there if they were letting anyone in. Mm-hmm. That was the other thing. They were very happy to let the Chilkats run that part of the business, and actually so was the Hudson Bay Company, who traded back and forth with the Russians. Nicholas I didn't believe in that newfangled steamboat technology. Everything was sailing ships. The last battles of sailing warships were in the Crimean War. But the Hudson Bay Company had good steamships. They could zip into Koh'Klux and do deals and zip out. One of the problems that Davis faced when he got here was the Hudson Bay Company running around various villages and saying, you don't want to trust those Americans. They're not trustworthy people. They're suspicious. Don't believe those bluecoats. And it took a while to get them out of there. When he first went up to Koh'Klux, when the first American troops got towards the Koh'Klux area, they were met by canoes flying Union Jacks, which was the sign that you're going to trade with the Hudson Bay Company. And they said, strike those colors and raise ours instead. Anyways, it's all a fascinating history. But, the books were a lot of fun to write because I knew nothing about Alexander. I thought I knew a lot about Seward. It would be easy, but in fact, there is so much known about Seward in America that paring it down to, a short book was the tricky part there. He did so much during his life. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's staggering. We would not be the United States of America had William Seward not been Secretary of State when he was. Senator and Secretary of State. It just wouldn't have happened. And if the Union had fallen apart down the line, what would have happened? Would we have been in a position in the world wars to intervene the way we did, so decisively? Would we have a totally different world now? It's fascinating to think about these things. I put some of these conjectures in books. I can't help myself. This is one thing historians do, because we can't make up stuff. We have to just kind of say what happens and go with it, and we're not authors. We're reporters. And, but we all have this little disease. What if John Wilkes Booth's gun had been the one that jammed, and Lewis Powell's gun had been the one that worked? And Seward had died, and Lincoln had lived. Would have been a very different America at the end of the war at that point. The guy who made the bomb that killed Alexander, he was like this munitions genius, kind of like that. He was waiting to be executed, and his lawyer went to see him in his cell, and he sees him frantically working on all this paper with numbers and writings and diagrams and things like that, and he said, working on your appeal. He said, no, you have to get these papers to the Scientific Academy. They have to be shown to the scientists who will know what I'm talking about here. This is a machine that will fly. And it was stuffed in a drawer for about 30 years before someone opened the drawer and discovered it was a machine that could fly using dynamite. His idea was to build this platform that would all these successive explosions. It looks like suicide to me. But, I mean, you wonder, what if Alexander III had sort of the sense or the advisement to say, spare this guy and have him work on this project? It would have, sometime in the 1880s, given Russia a super weapon that no one could have, they could have taken Eastern Europe in a heartbeat. The army in the field couldn't have fought against it. But it's a fabulous thing. There's a crater on the moon named for the man, Nicholas Koh'Klux.
Did they build a prototype?
How's
Did
that?
they build a prototype of the dynamite?
No, they never built a prototype. Like I said, I don't think the damn thing would work, actually. It looked like, the sketches that I've seen of it, I was thinking, no, you're not. But I'm not a rocket scientist. And the rocket science, they would have at least had the technology to start trying things out and seeing what was working and what wasn't working. And it would have been it would have been astonishing to think about. The Russians were actually, their scientists achieved some amazing things way before Sputnik. They were the first to come up with telegraph, using batteries to make telegraphs. They couldn't figure out how to, use it across country, but they got that going. The Russian soldiers in the Crimean War were the first to get anesthetics while they were being operated on. Seward's oldest daughter, first daughter, died of smallpox about 1836 or so. The people in Alaska's children in Russian communities did not die of smallpox. They had vaccinations. The Tsar, Nicholas, as recalcitrant as he was about modern things, he wanted everyone in the whole freaking empire to have smallpox vaccinations, and they got them. So it was kind of amazing. In places outside Russian rule, smallpox was a terrible plague, of course, but not in Sitka, not in Kodiak, not in Alaska. Anyway, well, thank you all for coming out, and I can answer more questions one-on-one if you like, but it's getting late. My voice is tired and you are tired.